The year was 1740, and Britain stood at the height of its ambition. Her ships ruled the sea lanes from the cold grey waters of the Channel to the warm turquoise reaches of the Caribbean. But even as her empire expanded, conflict shadowed the horizon. A distant war with Spain, fought not on land but upon the vast, unpredictable ocean. In the harbours of Portsmouth the wind carried the scent of pitch and salt, mingled with the deep timbre of church bells marking the morning watch. Along the quays, hundreds of men bustled, sailors in rough canvas coats, shipwrights hammering oak planks, dock hands hauling barrels of powder and biscuit aboard the waiting fleet. At the centre of this flurry stood one man, Commodore George Anson. Tall, reserved and precise, he carried the quiet authority of a man used to both command and hardship. His eyes, cool and thoughtful, scanned the grey horizon, where 6 ships rested at anchor. They were not the finest vessels in His Majesty's Navy. Indeed, some were old and poorly fitted, but they were bound for a task of immense daring, to sail around Cape Horn, enter the Pacific Ocean, and strike at the heart of Spanish wealth. For centuries, Spain had ruled those waters alone. Her Manila Galleons, vast ships laden with silver and silk, sailed each year across the Pacific, from Mexico to the Philippines, their holds heavy with treasure. If captured, even one such ship would be worth a fortune that could alter the course of a war. That was Anson's mission: to find those galleons, to survive the passage, to complete what few men had ever dared, a voyage around the world. The fleet gathered slowly, ship by ship, until 6 vessels rode together in the grey waters of Spithead. HMS Centurion, Anson's flagship, proud and solid at 60 guns. The Gloucester, sturdy and broad. The Severn and Pearl, smaller frigates, swift and sharp. The Wager, a slower transport heavy with stores. And the Little Trial, a sloop of modest size but brave spirit. Below decks, men packed the spaces tight, more than 1,900 souls in all. Sailors, marines, ship's boys, gunners, surgeons, cooks, carpenters, and even a few botanists and clerks. They had volunteered for many reasons: duty, poverty, adventure, or simply the promise of prize money that could change a life. Among the crowds along the dock stood wives and children, their faces pale in the dawn light. Some waved kerchiefs, others watched silently, tears hidden in the folds of their scarves. They knew, as all seafaring families did, that goodbyes at the quay were sometimes the last words ever spoken. By mid-morning, the tide began to turn. A signal flag climbed the Centurion's mainmast, fluttering against the pale sky. Drums rolled across the decks, and orders rang out. "Loose the topsails!" cried the boatswains. "Heave anchor!" The great iron chains groaned, the anchors lifted, dripping from the water, and the sails unfurled, white against the dark sea. The wind filled them slowly, catching, swelling, drawing the ships forward one by one. From the shore, the fleet looked like a line of ghosts moving into the mist. The sound of cheering drifted faintly across the water, mixed with the tolling of bells. Cannons fired in salute, their echoes rolling away over the Solent. Anson stood upon the quarterdeck, hands clasped behind his back, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. Behind him the flag of St. George snapped in the wind. Before him stretched the open sea, a promise and a warning. He said little. Those who served under him would later remember that he rarely raised his voice, even in crisis. His command came from presence, not from noise. He believed in discipline, in patience, in order, virtues that would soon be tested beyond measure. As the fleet rounded the Isle of Wight, the last of England faded from view. The grey cliffs blurred into haze, and the ocean opened wide before them, a restless plain of blue and silver that reached to the ends of the world. Below decks, hammocks swayed with the roll of the ship. The men found their places, gun crews at their stations, midshipmen at their charts, cooks stirring salted beef in iron pots. The smell of pitch, smoke and brine filled every corner. Rats scurried unseen between barrels of biscuit and powder. At sunset, the fleet spread across the horizon, their sails glowing amber in the dying light. The men climbed the rigging to furl canvas for the night, singing softly as they worked. Old shanties about home and harbour, their voices carrying faintly over the wind. When darkness fell, only the faint lanterns at each stern marked their presence. The ships rose and fell gently upon the tide, the sea sighing beneath them. From the deck of the Centurion, Anson looked out upon his small armada. 6 ships, thousands of miles from their goal, and not yet aware of the storms, hunger, and despair that waited beyond the edge of the world. He touched the rail of his ship, the wood smooth beneath his hand. "Let it begin," he murmured. And so it did. The fleet sailed south, chasing the line of the horizon, toward Madeira, toward Brazil, and eventually toward the roaring latitudes where the Atlantic ends and the Pacific begins. The sun sank into the water, and the ocean darkened into silence. The wind hummed through the rigging like a low, eternal song. The adventure had begun. The morning the fleet left sight of England, the wind blew steady from the west, cool and clean, carrying the faintest trace of heather and rain. By the second dawn, there was only sea in every direction, a deep blue that shifted with the light and sky that curved wide as eternity. The world had grown simpler now, sky above, sea below, and between them, the slow, patient heartbeat of the ship. Each vessel in Anson's fleet moved in its place, 6 pale clouds of canvas gliding southward, keeping their line upon the horizon. The Centurion, largest and strongest, sailed at the center, her guns gleaming like silent sentinels along her decks. Aboard her, the rhythm of the voyage settled in. Life at sea was a world of order, of bells, watches, and duty. The day began before sunrise, with the ship's bell striking 4 times. Lanterns were doused, hammocks stowed, decks scrubbed with sea water until they glistened in the early light. The air filled with the smell of brine and oak, of smoke from the galley fires where breakfast, salted pork and hard biscuit, was being boiled into something that might almost be called stew. The men ate quickly, leaning against the guns, the sea rocking beneath their feet. Then came the work, repairing sails, coiling rope, pumping bilge, polishing brass. The ship was alive, and every man a part of its pulse. When the sun rose high, its light poured down like molten silver. The water flashed with color, turquoise, then green, then deep cobalt as they crossed the continental shelf. Dolphins followed in their wake, leaping through the foam like messengers of the sea. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries fading each day until even they disappeared, leaving only the sound of wind in the rigging. The ocean was beautiful, but it was also endless. By the second week, the men began to understand what that truly meant. No land, no change, no rest from the wind or the slow, ceaseless roll of the hull. Some grew quiet, others restless. A few took comfort in routine. In the steady clank of pulleys, the call of the boatswain's whistle, the daily ration of rum mixed with water known as grog, warming their bellies in the cool evenings. At sunset, when the watch changed, the sea turned to gold. The horizon seemed to burn, the clouds glowing like embers. The men would sit upon the gun carriages talking softly, of Portsmouth taverns, of sweethearts left behind, of the smell of rain on English soil. Above them, the sails snapped gently in the dying wind. The Centurion creaked and sighed like an old creature content with motion. Sometimes Anson would walk the deck at these hours, silent and thoughtful. His officers saluted, but he waved them off. He was a man who preferred quiet over ceremony. His gaze was steady upon the horizon, measuring wind, light, and the distant promise of Madeira, their first destination. His mind never rested. He knew how fragile such expeditions were. Storms could scatter them, Disease could take 100 men before breakfast. And always, the great unknown waited beyond the horizon, the furious seas of Cape Horn, where even the bravest captains had vanished. Still, he believed in preparation and in patience. The sea rewards the measured hand, he would say, not the reckless heart. Below decks, the world was different. The air was thick with the smell of salt, tar, sweat, and wet rope. Hammocks swayed from beams like cocoons. Men snored softly, boots tucked into their nets above to keep them from tumbling in the night. Rats moved in the shadows, bold and familiar. In the dim light of lanterns, sailors carved small charms from wood, tiny ships, hearts, or crosses, tokens of luck. The midshipmen, young and wide-eyed, studied their charts by candlelight, learning the mysteries of latitude and tide. The surgeon checked his stores, laudanum for pain, vinegar for cleaning wounds, a few jars of citrus juice against the creeping threat of scurvy. By the third week, the weather began to turn. The Atlantic was no longer gentle. Clouds thickened, the wind rose, the ships rolled heavily, their masts groaning. Waves crashed over the forecastle, sending spray cascading across the deck. Men lashed barrels and cannon in place, singing rough sea songs to steady their courage. The rain fell for 3 days without pause. The ocean turned slate grey, the horizon lost in mist. Below decks, the air grew foul and close. Yet through it all, Anson's discipline held the fleet steady. They were sighted by no ships, only the endless expanse of moving water. When the storm passed, it left behind a world washed clean. The sun broke through, dazzling the waves, and a rainbow arched across the sky. Men climbed the rigging to dry the sails, their laughter echoing faintly as if in relief. Weeks passed in this rhythm of calm and fury, light and shadow. The sea taught them patience. It humbled them. At last, after more than a month of sailing, the cry went up from the masthead. Land ho! The island of Madeira rose from the water like an emerald set in silver. Its cliffs shone white in the sunlight, and the scent of flowers drifted faintly across the wind. Anchoring in the Bay of Funchal, the men looked upon the land as though it were paradise itself. The decks filled with sound, laughter, shouts, the creak of lowering boats. After so many days of blue and grey, the green hills and red rooftops were almost too beautiful to believe. They would take on fresh water, fruit and supplies before continuing south. It was a small reprieve, a pause before the ocean's next trial. That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Anson stood upon the quarterdeck once more. The lights of Madeira flickered softly along the shore. The scent of oranges and wine filled the air. He allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, a faint smile. The fleet had survived the first leg. The ocean had accepted their presence, for now. But beyond the calm harbour, he knew, lay the open sea, the long voyage toward Brazil, and then the furious waters of Cape Horn. The wind turned cool as twilight deepened. The ships rocked gently in the dark, their lanterns swaying like fireflies upon the waves. The crew slept soundly for the first time in weeks, and far out to sea, the tide whispered softly against their hulls, as though promising both danger and destiny. By the time the fleet left the warm harbours of Brazil, the air had begun to change. The days grew shorter, the wind more restless. The soft blue calm of the tropics gave way to a steel-coloured sea, heavy with mist. The sun dimmed behind veils of cloud, and the horizon stretched grey and cold and endless. This was the Southern Ocean, a place sailors spoke of in half-whispers, as though it could hear them. It was said that the winds there never stopped blowing, that the waves were taller than a church steeple, that even the albatross flew with effort. And at the edge of that wild world lay Cape Horn, the gateway between two oceans, the most feared passage on earth. Anson's fleet sailed on into that gathering grey. The ships creaked and rolled beneath their spreading sails. The air smelled of cold iron and salt. Each morning a frost clung to the rigging, glinting faintly in the weak sunlight. The men had never known such cold. Their breath hung in white clouds. Their hands cracked and bled from the ropes. The sea hissed and foamed around them, colder than ice, alive with unseen power. At first the wind came in steady gusts, strong but manageable. The fleet adjusted its course, shortening sail, tightening ropes. Anson's voice, calm and precise, carried across the decks. "Hold fast. Keep your stations." But the wind did not relent. It grew, hour by hour, until it howled through the masts like a living thing. The sea darkened to iron, then to black. Waves rose higher, tipped with white foam that flew like snow across the decks. The fleet was soon scattered across miles of ocean. Night fell, and the storm deepened. The wind screamed in the rigging, tearing sails like paper. The sea rose in mountains, crashing over the bows, washing across the gun decks. The Centurion pitched and rolled so violently that men were thrown from their hammocks. The lanterns swayed madly, shadows leaping across the dripping walls. "Reef the topsails," came the cry. Men climbed into the storm, their hands frozen upon the wet ropes, the wind snatching at them like invisible claws. The decks tilted at impossible angles, the ocean roaring in every direction. One by one, masts cracked, ropes snapped, barrels broke loose. The smell of salt and pitch filled the air. Voices were lost to the wind. For days, no one knew how many. The storm raged without pause. The sky and sea were one vast grey fury. Men who tried to speak could only move their lips. The roar drowned all sound. Sleep was impossible. Food was gone. The sea, it seemed, had become a single unending wave. Ships vanished into the mist. The Seven, the Pearl, gone without signal, forced back toward the Atlantic. The Voyager, heavy with stores, was driven far south, out of sight, into waters few had ever seen. The Trial and Gloucester fought to stay near the Centurion, but the distance between them grew with every hour. On the Centurion's deck, Anson stood lashed to the mizzen, his cloak whipping about him, his hat torn away by the wind. His face was calm, unreadable, carved by the rain. He gave no sign of fear, only brief, clear orders, each one carried through the chaos by his officers. "Ease the helm, strike the main topsail, keep her before the sea." The men obeyed, not because they hoped to win, but because it was the only way to live. Lightning flashed across the clouds, illuminating walls of water that rose like black cliffs on every side. The ship climbed them, shuddering, then plunged down into the valleys between, the masts disappearing into spray. It was said that time itself lost meaning, that the storm lasted not hours or days, but eternity. Below decks, men prayed, holding tight to beams as water surged through the scuppers. Others sat in silence, eyes closed, lips moving soundlessly. The surgeon worked by lantern light, binding the hands of men torn by rope or frost. And yet, even in that chaos, there was a strange beauty, the kind only the sea can make. The world had been reduced to elements: water, wind, darkness, and light. There was nothing else. No sound but the storm's breathing, no thought but survival. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wind began to fade. Not all at once, but slowly, reluctantly, the long sigh of a storm that had exhausted itself. The waves still rose high, but their fury softened. The clouds thinned. Through a break in the grey, a shaft of pale sunlight fell upon the water. The sea was still dangerous, but alive again, no longer wrathful, merely vast. When the officers counted the men, they found that dozens were gone. Some swept overboard, others frozen where they had stood. The Centurion herself was battered nearly beyond repair, masts splintered, sails torn, the decks warped from strain. But she floated still, her flag tattered, yet flying. Anson looked out over the heaving sea. Of the 6 ships that had left England, only 3 remained in sight, and even those were little more than shadows upon the horizon. The fleet had passed through the gate of the world and paid its price. The storm had broken them, scattered them, remade them. They had crossed into the Pacific, the loneliest ocean on earth. That night the sea was calm for the first time in weeks. The sky cleared, revealing stars bright and cold above the rigging. The men lay upon the deck, too tired to sleep, staring upward in silence. Anson stood alone by the helm. The Centurion creaked softly beneath his boots. The air smelled of salt and wood and smoke. He whispered, "So be it." For beyond that calm horizon waited another world, the blue immensity of the Pacific, and all its dangers still to come. The voyage would go on. The sea would not be done with them yet. When dawn finally came, it was soft and pale, like light filtering through glass. The sea, after weeks of roaring fury, now lay heavy and grey beneath a still sky. The wind was gone. The ocean rolled in long, slow swells that moved like the breathing of some vast creature asleep. The Centurion drifted alone. Her sails hung limp, her decks scarred and dark with salt. The storm had taken nearly everything. Her mast splintered, her rigging torn, her hull leaking. The men, hollow-eyed and silent, moved with the stiff, slow rhythm of exhaustion. Around her, the Pacific stretched endless in every direction, a world of water without a horizon, without sound. Days passed, and the sea remained calm, too calm. The wind did not return. The ships that had survived the passage were nowhere to be seen. It was as if the fleet had been swallowed whole. Anson's flagship was now a single heartbeat in an ocean without end. The men repaired what they could. They patched sails with rope and canvas, pumped water from the bilge, and tended to the sick. But disease had already begun to whisper through the decks. Scurvy, the sailors' invisible enemy. It began as weakness, then swelling in the limbs, bleeding gums, a deep ache in the bones. The body, starved of what it needed, began to consume itself. There was little to be done. No fresh food, no port, only salted meat and hard biscuit dry as stone. Each morning, a bell tolled softly as the dead were brought to the rail. Wrapped in canvas, a shot tied to their feet, they were given back to the sea. The bodies slipped into the grey water with a gentle sound, one more offering to the deep. The ocean closed over them without trace, and still the wind did not rise. The ship drifted. The sun burned by day. At night the stars were so bright they seemed to tremble. The men stared at them in silence, some praying, some weeping quietly in their hammocks. The sea was no longer their enemy. It was too vast, too still. It had become something else, a kind of eternity. Anson kept to his duties. He measured their course each morning, wrote his log, spoke to the officers. His calm was unbroken, though his face had grown gaunt, his hair streaked with salt. When he walked the deck at night, he often paused to look upon the horizon, a thin line of silver under the moon, no nearer, no farther. The men began to call it the endless sea. Food dwindled, water grew foul. The carpenter worked day and night to keep the hull tight, hammering pitch into every seam. The surgeon's hands shook as he treated wounds that would not heal. Yet somehow the ship endured. Weeks became months. One morning, a faint cry broke the stillness, a sound both joyous and disbelieving. From the masthead came the words every sailor dreamed of hearing. "Land, land to the west." At first it seemed a mirage, a trick of light upon the horizon. But as the hours passed, it grew clearer, green hills rising from the sea, their slopes gleaming under the sun. The men wept openly. After 91 days without landfall, they had reached Juan Fernandez Island, a tiny paradise in the middle of the world's emptiest ocean. When the Centurion dropped anchor in its sheltered bay, the men could smell the earth, real, living earth, carried to them on the wind. Birds wheeled overhead. The water near shore was clear and bright, filled with darting fish. The crew went ashore in small boats, stumbling as they stepped onto the sand. Many fell to their knees and kissed the ground. Others simply lay back upon the grass and stared at the sky. Some wept silently, overcome by the sight of green after so long surrounded by grey. The island was rich beyond imagining. Fresh water, fruit, wild goats, herbs. The men gorged themselves, their bodies trembling with relief. Fires were lit, clothes dried, wounds cleaned. For the first time in months, laughter was heard aboard the Centurion. Anson ordered tents to be built ashore, the ship repaired plank by plank. They buried their dead with quiet ceremony, marking the graves with wooden crosses that leaned gently in the sea wind. Each day the men grew stronger. Their skin regained colour, their limbs steadied, their eyes began to shine again. The island was their salvation, a gift of mercy from the sea that had nearly claimed them. At night, the campfires flickered against the hills, and the ocean's steady whisper returned, no longer menacing but calm, familiar, eternal. The men slept soundly, lulled by the sound of waves washing upon sand. Anson walked alone along the beach, his boots sinking softly into the wet sand. The stars above were brilliant, mirrored in the still water. He thought of the ships that had not arrived, of the Wager, the Pearl, the Seven, all lost or scattered. He thought of the men buried beneath the waves and of the long road yet to come. But in that quiet moment, he also felt something else. The strange, humble peace that comes only after survival. The knowledge that to live, even a little longer, is itself a victory. The sea had tested them, broken them, and spared them. And beyond the horizon, its voice still called, soft as a lullaby, endless as time. The days that followed their arrival at Juan Fernandez Island passed like a dream. For the first time in many months, the men of the Centurion slept upon solid ground. They awoke to birdsong, to the scent of green leaves and damp soil, to the soft murmur of waves breaking upon the shore. The ocean, once a roaring enemy, now whispered gently in the distance, a reminder, not a threat. The island was a paradise of sorts, untouched, fertile, alive. Streams of clear water ran down from the hills, cool and sweet. Wild goats grazed in the meadows, and fruit trees hung heavy with oranges, figs, and berries. The men wandered as if lost in wonder, tasting, touching, listening. Some fell to their knees and thanked God. Under Anson's careful direction, the ship's carpenters and riggers set to work. Broken masts were replaced, torn sails mended, leaks sealed with pitch. Day by day, the Centurion was remade, her timbers drying in the sun, her decks scrubbed clean of salt and despair. On shore, tents rose among the palms. The sick were carried out of the ship and laid upon the grass, where the sea breeze cooled their fevered skin. Many began to recover. The colour returned to their faces. Their hands grew steady again. Evenings were peaceful. Fires flickered along the beach, their smoke curling into the golden dusk. The men sat in small groups, cooking fish over the flames, telling quiet stories. They laughed again, softly, carefully, as though afraid the sound might vanish if they were too loud. Anson often walked alone at sunset, the sand cool beneath his boots. The horizon burned with colours of rose and amber, fading into the vast blue of the Pacific. He would stop and listen, to the sigh of the waves, to the murmur of men at rest, to the faint creak of his repaired ship anchored in the bay. He knew this peace could not last. The ocean beyond was wide and uncharted. Their true mission, the hunt for the Manila Galleon, still waited far away. But for now, the island offered something they had forgotten the shape of: stillness. Weeks passed. The men grew stronger. Their laughter carried farther each night, echoing against the cliffs. By the time the Centurion was ready to sail once more, she gleamed in the sunlight, like a living thing reborn. On the morning of departure, the men stood along her deck, watching the green hills recede into mist. The island had saved them. They left behind small graves marked with wooden crosses, reminders of what the sea had taken. But they carried away a spark of hope. As the sails filled and the ship turned toward the open ocean, Anson looked once more at the fading shore and whispered, "Thank you." The wind rose, the sea stirred, and the Centurion moved onward, stronger now, and so were the men aboard her. When the Centurion left Juan Fernandez Island, her sails shone white against the sky, clean and strong once more. The wood beneath her decks had dried, her hull re-caulked, her masts replaced. She was whole again, scarred, yes, but sound. The men stood at their stations with renewed purpose. Their bodies had filled out, their faces no longer hollow. They were fewer now. The storm and sickness had taken most, yet those who remained were bound together by something stronger than duty: survival. The ocean greeted them quietly. The wind filled the sails, and the great ship leaned into it with a sigh. The Centurion pointed north, her bow cutting through blue water toward the long, wild coast of South America, enemy territory. For months, the fleet had been reduced to one ship, but now that ship sailed as if guided by destiny. They moved along the Chilean coast, an untamed line of mountains and fog, where Spanish settlements lay scattered like hidden embers. Somewhere along these shores, Anson knew, the lifeblood of Spain flowed. Her silver, her trade, her ships. Each dawn, the men woke to the rhythm of the sea. The decks were washed, the guns polished, the rigging checked. They had returned to the steady discipline that had kept them alive. Soon they sighted their first prize, a small Spanish merchant ship, heavy with goods bound for Lima. The Centurion gave chase, her sails billowing. The drums beat to quarters, the guns run out. The air filled with the smell of powder and salt. Anson's command was calm and sure. "Steady now," he said, voice low but clear. "Hold her course." When they fired, the sound rolled across the water like thunder. The Spanish ship struck her colors before a second broadside. The men cheered, not from bloodlust, but relief. It was proof that fortune had turned, that their struggle had not been in vain. From that day onward, the Centurion became a ghost upon the Pacific. She struck swiftly, vanished into the mist, and appeared again hundreds of miles away. Her men grew expert in the art of silent approach and sudden fury. They captured storeships and small galleons, taking what they needed: food, charts, tools, even news of the world beyond the sea. Each victory fed the men's spirits, though Anson remained steady, never boastful. He knew how thin the line between triumph and ruin could be. In the evenings, when the decks were quiet and the sea lay calm beneath the stars, he would walk alone, listening to the creak of the masts and the whisper of waves. The lanterns glowed softly in the rigging, and the ocean reflected them like fireflies drifting on glass. He thought often of the men who had not survived, of the ships lost beyond the Horn, of the graves left behind on the island. Every victory carried their memory. The Centurion sailed north through months of shifting weather, fog and heat, rain and calm. The Pacific stretched on, immense and unending, yet it no longer felt like exile. It had become their element, their home. By the time they reached the coast of Mexico, the men spoke of the sea as though it were alive. Not cruel now, but watchful, testing, teaching. They raided the Spanish outpost at Paita, their approach silent beneath a moonless sky. The landing was swift. The town's defenders fled. The men moved through empty streets lit by torches, taking supplies and stores. Anson forbade looting or cruelty. His orders were clear. "We are sailors, not destroyers." By dawn, the Centurion was already miles offshore, her holds filled with food and powder. Behind them, The fires of Paita flickered faintly in the pale morning light. The men ate fresh bread that day, the first in months. The air was warm, the sea calm. Even the gulls followed in their wake, calling softly over the wind. They had become a crew tempered by every hardship, bound to their ship and to one another. And somewhere far to the west, across the unbroken blue, lay the treasure they sought, the Manila Galleon, the richest ship in the world. When Anson stood upon the quarterdeck that evening, the sky was painted gold and violet. The Centurion cut through the water like a blade of light. He felt the familiar pull of the horizon, that promise of the unknown, the quiet challenge of the sea. He said nothing, but the men around him could sense it. The journey was entering its next chapter. The long hunt had begun. By the time the Centurion left the Mexican coast behind, she had become a creature of the sea, worn but unbroken, her timbers weathered to silver, her sails patched like a quilt of ghosts. The men moved about her decks with the calm precision of those who have learned the ocean's moods. They spoke little, their work smooth, automatic, trimming sail, manning the pumps, scrubbing the decks with sand until the wood gleamed pale under the sun. Ahead stretched nothing but water. The Pacific lay wide and glittering, blue as burnished steel beneath the noon light. Its vastness humbled even the bravest men. Some nights they felt as though the ship drifted not upon the sea, but within the sky itself, surrounded by stars above and below. They were searching for a ghost. The Manila Galleon, a single ship that crossed the Pacific once each year, carrying silver from the mines of New Spain to the markets of the East. Somewhere across thousands of miles of open water, she sailed, unseen, unhurried, following the rhythm of winds and currents older than any nation. Finding her would be like finding a single heartbeat in the belly of the world. Each morning, Anson gathered his officers upon the quarterdeck. They pored over charts, measured the sun with their quadrants, and plotted the shifting lines of latitude. The sea breeze whispered through their coats. Sometimes there was laughter, a rare thing now, soft and genuine. Days melted into one another. The ocean changed color with the light, green, blue, silver, gray. Flying fish darted like sparks across the surface. Albatrosses wheeled in slow, effortless circles. The sound of the wind filled every space. At night, the sea glowed faintly with phosphorescence. The Centurion left a trail of light behind her, as if she were a lantern drifting through the dark. The men watched in silence from the rail, mesmerized. Some said it was the souls of lost sailors guiding them onward. Others just stared, lost in thought. Weeks turned to months. Supplies grew thin once more. Water barrels soured in the heat. The men's hands grew raw from the ropes, their eyes ringed with fatigue. But no one complained. They had learned to live with the sea's long silence, to trust that patience itself was a kind of courage. Some days, a sail would appear on the horizon, only to vanish again in haze. Hope flared, then faded. The Centurion pressed on. The charts showed little now, just empty space, unbroken blue. Anson kept to his quiet routines. Each evening he wrote in his log, his script steady, the ink dark and clean. "This day calm," one entry read. "Crew in fair spirits." Still no sight of our quarry. His officers watched him closely. They knew he would not turn back. He had come too far, lost too much. The hunt was no longer about gold or glory. It was about purpose. To complete the circle of the world, to bring his men home with honor, to prove that even a battered ship could outlast fate. One evening, as the sun sank behind the endless horizon, the sea turned molten gold. The light stretched across the waves like a road to heaven. The men stood silently at the rails, faces warm with the glow. From somewhere deep in the rigging, a sailor began to hum an old tune. a slow, wordless song of home and harbour. Others joined softly, their voices blending with the hush of the wind. It was not loud, not joyful, but steady, a song to keep the soul upright against the pull of distance. Anson listened, eyes upon the horizon. The sound carried across the deck like a prayer. "Let them sing," he said quietly. "The sea listens too." For many weeks more they sailed, following the stars, chasing the faintest whispers of rumour and wind. The Pacific remained vast and empty, yet they no longer feared it. The silence had become their companion, vast, deep, and strangely kind. And then one dawn the lookout called down from the masthead. His voice cracked with disbelief and joy. "Sail ho!" Off the starboard bow. Every man on deck turned at once. Far away, upon the glowing rim of the world, a small white shape moved against the light. Anson lifted his glass and stared. The distance was great, but even from there he could see it. A ship, broad and slow, sails full and heavy. It was her, the Manila Galleon. After years of pursuit across half the globe, they had found her at last. Dawn broke like the lifting of a veil. The sea lay smooth and pale, the sky washed clean by the night's soft rain. The Centurion drifted in silence, her sails trimmed, her guns run out, her men at their stations. And there, to the west, upon the rim of the morning light, sailed the Manila Galleon. She was vast, a floating fortress of oak and gold, her sails gleaming in the sun. The Nuestra Señora de Covadonga, pride of the Spanish Pacific. Her hull was black and high, her flags bright as flame. Within her holds lay the riches of half a world, silver from Mexico, porcelain from China, silks from Manila, treasures enough to fill a kingdom's coffers. For 3 years Anson had chased this dream through storm, sickness, and endless sea. Now, at last, it was real. He stood upon the quarterdeck, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes calm and sharp. "Steady as she goes," he said softly. "We close with the tide." The wind was gentle. The Centurion moved forward, cutting through the quiet water. Her crew, fewer than 200 men now, moved with silent precision. There was no shouting, no clamour. Only the low creak of timber, the flap of canvas, the soft click of gunlocks being primed. As the range closed, the two ships became mirrors upon the sea. One a ghost from England, weathered and lean. The other a floating palace of empire and wealth. When they were within musket range, Anson gave a single nod. "Fire." The Centurion's broadside thundered out, not in rage, but in rhythm. A roll of sound, deep and measured, echoing across the calm Pacific. Smoke drifted across the decks, pale against the light. The galleon answered, her own guns blazing, the air filled with the hum of iron and splintered wood. The sea boiled with falling shot, yet the Centurion held her course, her men working in smooth, practiced motions, loading, aiming, firing again. Hour by hour, the ships circled each other like weary beasts of the deep. The smoke hung low over the water. The air smelled of salt, fire, and oak. Anson remained steady through it all. He moved among his men, speaking softly, never raising his voice. His presence was a compass, a fixed point in the chaos. "Hold your line," he said. "Make every shot count." And they did. Cannon by cannon, the galleon's fire slackened, her masts splintered, her sails burned. The cries of her crew carried faintly across the water, not of fear, but exhaustion. At last, after nearly 2 hours, her guns fell silent. A white flag fluttered at her stern. The Centurion's men lowered their weapons. A deep stillness fell, the kind that follows thunder. The only sound was the gentle lap of waves against the hulls and the creak of the wounded ships settling into peace. The galleon had surrendered. Anson removed his hat and bowed his head for a moment. "It is done," he said quietly. When his men boarded the prize, they moved with awe. Her decks were wide as courtyards, her cabins filled with silver bars, silks, spices, carved chests from the Indies, and delicate porcelain that shimmered like moonlight. They had found what the crown had dreamed of, treasure enough to pay for a war, to buy back every hardship they had endured. But more than gold, they had found proof that their endurance meant something, that courage, patience, and order could triumph even against the endless sea. That night, as the sun sank over the calm Pacific, the men gathered upon the Centurion's deck. They said little, their faces lit by the glow of lanterns. The sky above them blazed with stars, and the captured galleon floated beside them, silent and still, a monument to the end of their long pursuit. Anson stood alone by the helm, the sea wind in his coat. The air was soft, the waves gentle. He thought of the journey that had brought them here, the storms of Cape Horn, the empty Pacific, the graves upon the island. Every moment, every loss had led to this quiet, gleaming calm. The ocean around them shimmered in the starlight. It was beautiful, vast, and unending, not conquered, never tamed, but for one brief night, kind. The battle was over, the smoke had cleared, and for the first time in years, the sea lay utterly still. The Centurion and the captured Manila Galleon drifted side by side in the golden light of evening. The sky was wide and tender, fading from rose to blue. The water around them shimmered like glass. The men moved softly, their voices low as if unwilling to disturb the calm that had settled over the ocean. They were sailors who had seen too much, storms, hunger, death. Yet now they stood upon decks heavy with treasure, the salt wind cool upon their faces and knew only stillness. The holds were filled with silver and silk, but what they truly carried was something quieter, the deep, steady strength that comes from survival. Anson ordered the ships made ready for the long return voyage. The galleon's cargo was transferred carefully aboard the Centurion, her crew treated with respect, her flag folded and stowed. There was no gloating, no harshness. The men of both ships had faced the same master, the sea, and in that they shared a strange kinship. The Centurion turned her bow westward once more, toward the setting sun, beginning the vast passage across the Pacific. Behind her, the waters closed, leaving only a long white trail upon the endless blue. Weeks passed. The winds were kind now, steady trades that filled the sails and carried them onward. The ship moved as though she remembered the way. The ocean changed with every day's light. At dawn, it was soft and grey. By noon, it blazed like hammered gold. By night, it shone with the faint silver glow of the stars reflected in her wake. The men slept easily for the first time in years, rocked by the same sea that had once threatened to destroy them. They sailed through the Marianas, then on toward China, anchoring at last in the great harbour of Macau, a place of spices, lanterns, and distant bells. There, word of their victory spread like wind through the markets. Merchants bowed, sailors whispered, even officials of the East India Company stared in awe at the battered ship from England that had circled half the world and struck gold. Anson replenished his stores, repaired his ship once more, and then, after months of rest, turned for home. They crossed the Indian Ocean, skirted the coast of Africa, and rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the same cape that had devoured so many ships before them. The sea was gentler now, as though it remembered them. The gales they had once feared seemed to bow their heads in passing. The voyage home was long but no longer cruel. The men grew bearded and brown from sun and salt. They sang again, quiet songs of England and home, of harbours and hearths. They spoke of families they had not seen in 4 years, of towns that might barely remember their names. At last, one grey morning, A cry went up from the masthead. "Land ho!" To the north, the sea shimmered silver under low clouds. On the horizon, faint and familiar, lay the green hills of England. The men crowded the rails, staring as if afraid to blink. Some laughed, others wept. As the Centurion entered the channel, church bells rang from the shore. Boats rowed out to meet her. Crowds gathered along the docks of Portsmouth, astonished, cheering, waving their hats and kerchiefs. The ship, thought long lost, had returned from the edge of the world. Her decks were scarred, her sails patched, her hull weathered, but her flag flew bright, proud against the grey English sky. When she dropped anchor at last, the sound echoed across the harbour, a deep, final note of completion. Anson stood upon the quarterdeck, his coat faded, his eyes calm. He said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, he removed his hat and looked to the horizon one last time. The sea stretched out before him, wide and eternal. He had crossed it, survived it, and in a way, belonged to it forever. The men were cheered as heroes. The treasure was carried ashore, gleaming in the torchlight. But that night, when the harbour fell silent and the crowds dispersed, the Centurion rested gently at her moorings, her timbers sighing with the tide. She had sailed around the world, the first British warship ever to do so. And though she would soon be dismantled, her spirit, and the memory of those who sailed her, would drift forever across the sea. In the years that followed her return, the tale of the Centurion spread like a tide through England. Her name was spoken with reverence, a ghost of oak and canvas that had circled the world and come home again. From London to the smallest coastal towns, sailors gathered in taverns to tell her story. Of storms and starvation, of the lost ships and the terrible passage round the Horn, of the island that saved them, and the golden prize captured at last upon a still Pacific dawn. But those who had truly sailed her rarely spoke in grand tones. When they spoke at all, it was softly, with a kind of quiet awe. They knew that the sea did not grant triumphs, only survival, and sometimes understanding. Commodore George Anson was honoured by the Crown and the Admiralty. He was made a peer of the realm, Lord Anson, and given command over new fleets, his reforms shaping the Royal Navy for generations to come. Yet those who knew him said he was never the same man. He carried the sea within him, not the noise of battle or storm, but its silence. He spoke little of treasure or victory. When asked what he remembered most, he would pause and say only, "The sound of the wind in the rigging." He spent his later years in quiet service, ensuring that future sailors would not suffer as his men had. His journals became legend, studied by captains who dreamed of far horizons. The lessons he wrote were simple: discipline, preparation, humanity, and above them all, patience. He understood that mastery of the sea was never about conquering it. The ocean cannot be conquered. It is older than nations, older than memory. It can only be respected, listened to, endured. The Centurion herself was eventually broken up, her timbers sold, her iron fittings melted down. Yet in every ship that followed, in every line of oak and canvas that left English shores, there was a trace of her spirit. The men who had sailed her lived on, scattered across the empire. Some found quiet harbours and built new lives. Others returned to sea, unable to bear the stillness of land. But each, in his own way, carried the same invisible mark, the knowledge that they had crossed the edge of the world and come back again, and the sea remembered them. Even now, when the night is calm and the wind blows from the west, sailors say you can sometimes hear it, a faint sound beneath the waves, like ropes creaking and timbers sighing. The Centurion still sails, they say, not upon the surface, but within the deep, circling the world in silence, her lanterns glowing faintly in the dark. a reminder that courage endures, and that even the smallest light can survive the storm. The ocean continues, eternal and unending. And somewhere within its vastness, the echo of Anson's voyage drifts on, the rhythm of wind and water, the heartbeat of men who refuse to yield. So as you rest now, listening to the slow breath of the sea beyond time, remember their journey, not for its treasure, but for its spirit. For every voyage, no matter how far or perilous, begins and ends with the same sound, the soft whisper of the tide upon the shore,